For over a century, war in the skies has shaped the course of history. From fragile wood and fabric biplanes to radar-evading stealth bombers, each era produced machines that did more than fight. They inspired fear. Sometimes it was the howl of dive-bombing sirens. Sometimes it was the shadow of a bomber no one else could see. Other times, it was the knowledge that once a certain fighter had you in its sights, escape was impossible. In this video, we talk about those planes that strike fear into the hearts of anyone unlucky enough to be in its sights. The story begins in the First World War, when aviation itself was still in its infancy. Pilots took to the skies in fragile machines of wood and canvas, armed with little more than a machine gun and courage. Yet, even in those early days, one aircraft rose above the rest. It was the Fokker DR-1 triplane. The year was 1917. The First World War had already raged for 3 long years, chewing up millions of lives in the mud and barbed wire of the Western Front. Above the trenches, a new battlefield had opened. What began in 1914 as primitive reconnaissance flights in fragile biplanes had, by 1917, become a deadly contest for control of the skies. Dogfighting was still new. Pilots flew without parachutes, strapped into machines made of canvas and woods, engines shaking the airframe, fuel tanks sitting just a few feet from their bodies. In the fall of 1917, a new aircraft appeared over the front lines. Short, stubby, with 3 narrow wings stacked one above the other, it looked ungainly compared to the sleek French SPADs and British Camels. But appearances were deceiving. The Allies soon realized that this machine is to be feared. That machine was the Fokker DR-1 triplane. Designed by Reinhold Platz at the Fokker company, the DR-1 was born in direct response to the Sopwith triplane flown by the British Royal Naval Air Service. German pilots had seen the maneuverability of that design and demanded their own. Fokker delivered. The DR-1 was slower than many of its opponents, with a maximum speed of just 115 miles per hour, but what it lacked in speed, it made up for with agility. Its 3 wings generated tremendous lift, allowing it to climb quickly and turn tighter than almost anything else in the sky. In a dogfight, the DR-1 was unmatched. Ernst Udet, one of Germany's top aces and later Luftwaffe commander, recalled, "The Fokker triplane was my favorite. It climbed like a monkey and maneuvered like the devil." Its weaponry was simple. 2 synchronized 7.92mm MG08/15 machine guns mounted directly in front of the cockpit. Thanks to Anthony Fokker's interrupter gear, the guns could fire through the propeller arc without striking the blades. This meant the pilot could aim the entire aircraft like a rifle. But the plane itself was only part of the story. What made the DR-1 truly legendary were the men who flew it, and none more so than Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. Richthofen painted his triplane bright crimson, daring enemy pilots to come after him. To Allied flyers, that flash of red meant death was near. To German airmen, it was a symbol of pride and confidence. Leading Jagdgeschwader 1, known as the Flying Circus for its brightly painted craft, Richthofen scored many of his final victories in the DR-1. The DR-1 could appear suddenly, dropping out of the clouds, its guns blazing. Many Allied reports describe the shock of seeing the red triplane diving in, out-turning fighters and cutting down stragglers before vanishing back into the haze. Yet, the DR-1 was far from perfect. Early versions suffered from structural weaknesses, particularly in the upper wing, leading to fatal accidents. Production was limited, and only around 320 were built in total, compared to the thousands of SPADs and Camels that were in service. By mid-1918, faster and more powerful Allied fighters were entering service, and the triplane's brief reign was ending. Richthofen himself was killed in combat in April of that year, possibly by ground fire while chasing an enemy Sopwith Camel. The triplane had never been the fastest nor the most advanced aircraft of its time, but it was perhaps the most feared. Its agility, its deadly guns, and above all, the aura created by the Red Baron made it a symbol of aerial combat in World War I. For the men who flew against it, the fear was real. For those who flew it, the pride was equally strong. In just a few short months, the Fokker DR-1 had turned the skies of Europe into a hunting ground, and it remains, even today, one of the most recognizable warplanes of the Great War. When the guns of the First World War finally fell silent in 1918, the age of the fighter ace had been born. Yet the machines that carried them to glory were already nearing the end of their usefulness. The biplane had dominated the war, but the world would not stand still for canvas and struts. In the years between the wars, aviation leapt forward at a staggering pace. Nations experimented with new designs, new engines, and new materials. It was a time of rapid change, when wood gave way to metal and the skies were filled with bold, sometimes risky innovations. And in the United States, one aircraft stood as a symbol of this new era. It was the Boeing P-26, better known as the Peashooter. The nickname sounded comical, almost dismissive, but for the pilots of slower, older biplanes across the Pacific, there was nothing funny about facing one. The P-26 was the first all-metal monoplane fighter to serve with the US Army Air Corps, and its arrival marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. With a top speed of 234 miles per hour, the Peashooter could outrun nearly every frontline biplane in its service. Its smooth, low-wing design was a vision of modernity, even if its fixed landing gear and open cockpit tied it visually to the past. Colonel Benjamin S. Kelsey, one of the Air Corps' test pilots, later reflected on what the aircraft meant to those who flew it. It wasn't perfect, but it was a leap forward. Once you flew a monoplane, you didn't want to go back. Armed with two 30 caliber Browning machine guns and able to carry small bombs, the Peashooter wasn't heavily armed by later standards. But in the 1930s, its speed and ability to dive gave it an edge. Against older biplane adversaries, the P-26 could dictate the fight. Chinese nationalist pilots flew the aircraft against the Imperial Japanese Air Force in the late 1930s. Against Japanese Type 91 biplanes, the P-26 proved decisive. One Chinese pilot reportedly told his wingman before a sortie, "If you dive first, they'll never catch you." That was the Peashooter's advantage: speed and diving power. It could strike, escape, and choose when to return. But aviation was moving too fast for the P-26 to hold the crown for long. By the late 1930s, retractable landing gear, enclosed cockpits, and heavier firepower were becoming the global standard. Compared to the Messerschmitt Bf-109s in Germany or the Mitsubishi A6Ms in Japan, the Peashooter already looked dated. And yet, even as the world entered World War II, a few Peashooters were still flying. In the Philippines, when Japan invaded in December 1941, Filipino pilots of the 6th Pursuit Squadron climbed into their outdated P-26s to face the enemy. They were hopelessly outmatched by the modern Zero, but they fought anyway. Captain Jesus Villamor led his squadron into combat, and against all odds, they scored kills. Villamor himself was credited with downing a Zero, proving that even a so-called Peashooter could still bite. Their bravery turned the little Boeing fighter into a legend in the Philippines, a symbol of resistance against overwhelming odds. Only about 150 P-26s were ever built, and few survived the war. Yet, for all its limitations, the Peashooter was a turning point. It was the bridge between two worlds, the last gasp of the old and the first breath of the new. As the Second World War erupted in 1939, the skies became as important as the seas or the battlefield below. Never before had aircraft played such a decisive role. Fighters, bombers, and attack planes were often the difference between victory and defeat. And unlike previous eras, there wasn't just one aircraft that defined the era. World War II produced several planes that terrified enemies and reshaped the way wars were fought. Some dominated early in the conflict, others arrived later and changed the balance of power. A few were so advanced that they seemingly belonged to another age entirely. The first of these was designed to terrify before its bombs even struck. The Junkers Ju-87, better known as the Stuka. The Stuka was designed from the start as a weapon of shock. Its inverted gull wings and fixed landing gear made it look almost archaic, even in 1939. But the Ju-87 was a true dive bomber. With its automatic dive brakes, it could plummet at angles over 70 degrees, line up its target, and release bombs with unnerving accuracy. Fitted into its landing gear were its iconic sirens, the Jericho Trompete. As the Stuka dove, the air-driven propellers wailed, amplifying the terror of its attack. The shriek was deliberate, meant to break enemy morale before the bombs even struck. In the opening campaigns of the war, the Stuka was devastating. In Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France, they destroyed bridges, smashed tanks, and scattered troops. Entire columns were thrown into chaos at the sight of them overhead. But the Stuka's dominance had limits. It was slow, barely capable of 240 miles per hour, and vulnerable against modern fighters. During the Battle of Britain, after some initial success, British Hurricanes and Spitfires tore through Ju-87 formations, forcing the Luftwaffe to withdraw them from contested skies. Yet, the Stuka refused to disappear. On the Eastern Front, it found a new role. Soviet air defenses were weak in the early years, and Stukas once again supported German ground forces with brutal effect. Specialized versions carried cannons to hunt tanks, and under pilots like Hans-Ulrich Rödel, the Ju-87 became infamous all over again. By the later years of the war, the Stuka was hopelessly outdated. Faster fighter bombers had replaced it, and Allied air superiority made flying one a near suicidal task. But its impact had already been made. The Stuka froze soldiers in place. Its dives destroyed columns and fortifications, and for much of Europe in 1939 and 1940, that scream from above was the voice of German conquest. But as the war dragged on, the balance shifted. Germany's terror weapon of the early years gave way to an Allied machine that would come to dominate the skies over Europe. Where once the Luftwaffe ruled, by 1944 it was on the defensive, and the aircraft leading that charge was sleek, fast, and built to go the distance. Enter the P-51 Mustang. Introduced in 1942 and refined with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang combined speed, agility, and most importantly, unmatched range. It had a range of 1,650 miles, or 2,650 kilometers with drop tanks, and it could cruise with bombers all the way to Berlin, fight off interceptors, and still have the legs to get home. With a top speed of around 440 miles per hour and 650 caliber machine guns, the P-51 was both fast and deadly. Luftwaffe pilots quickly recognized it as a new kind of threat, one they couldn't shake. At first, the Mustang was used in tactical roles, flying reconnaissance and ground attack. But when it was paired with the Merlin engine, its performance leapt ahead of nearly everything else in the sky. Suddenly, the US Army Air Forces had the long-range escort fighter they'd been waiting for. The difference was immediate. Daylight raids that had once meant dozens of bombers shot down now had cover all the way to the target and back. German pilots who had grown used to pouncing on unescorted bombers suddenly found themselves being hunted instead. Germany was already running short on experienced pilots, and the Mustang only accelerated the attrition. Skilled veterans were shot down, leaving inexperienced replacements to face an enemy they couldn't match. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of what it had been, and the P-51 was one of the main reasons why. The Mustang wrestled air superiority away from Germany. It hunted enemy fighters, swept the skies clear, and allowed the Allies to strike targets without crippling losses. By the end of the war, it had become one of the most effective and respected fighters in the world. The Mustang was feared because it changed the balance of power in the air. With it, the Allies took control of the skies over Europe and never gave them back. Meanwhile, across the world in the Pacific, the story had begun differently. Long before the Mustang reigned over Berlin, another fighter had already carved its name into history. It was light, agile, and had the range to strike across oceans. For Allied pilots in 1941, nothing inspired more dread than the sight of this plane. In those first desperate battles, it ruled the skies. Had the Allies not found a way to counter it, it might have gone down as the most feared plane of World War II. Instead, its reign was broken, and it earns its place here as runner-up. That fighter was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. Introduced in 1940, the Zero was Japan's answer to the modern air war. It was a marvel of design, lightweight, highly maneuverable, and with a range that far exceeded anything the Allies had. With drop tanks, it could fly nearly 2,000 miles, giving the Imperial Japanese Navy a reach that stunned their adversaries. When Japan launched its surprise attacks in December 1941, at Pearl Harbor, Malaya, and across the Philippines, the Zero spearheaded the offensive. At a time when most American and British fighters were slower and less capable, the Zero swept them aside. In those opening battles, squadrons of P-40 Warhawks, Brewster Buffaloes, and Hurricanes were chewed up with shocking ease. Over the Philippines, one engagement on December 10, 1941, saw just a handful of Zeros rip into a defending American formation. Within minutes, more than a dozen US aircraft were falling in flames. Allied pilots came to fear the sight of the long-nosed, pale green fighter that seemed to be able to twist and turn at impossible angles. The Zero was central to Japan's early conquests, flying from carriers, escorting bombers, and establishing control of the skies wherever the Japanese Navy struck. From Singapore to Rabaul, the Zero was the embodiment of Japan's rapid advance. But the same features that made it terrifying, its lightweight, extreme range, and agility, came at a cost. The Zero carried almost no armor. Its fuel tanks weren't self-sealing. A few bursts from Allied guns could turn it into a fireball. Early on, its enemies didn't live long enough to exploit these weaknesses. By 1943, however, the tide was shifting. Still, the Zero left its mark. For the first 2 years of the Pacific War, it ruled the skies and terrified its opponents. For Allied pilots in 1941 and 1942, to face a Zero was to fight on its own terms, and more often than not, that meant they didn't come back. As the war dragged on, the pace of aviation development only accelerated. Every year brought new fighters, faster engines, and deadlier weapons. And in Europe, the Germans unveiled something that looked and flew like it belonged to another age entirely. The most feared plane of World War II. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me 262 was sleek, shark-like, and frighteningly fast. Powered by two Yonkers Yumo 004 turbojet engines, it could reach speeds of 540 miles per hour, more than 100 miles per hour faster than the best Allied piston engine fighters. To those who first saw it in the skies, it seemed to defy belief. Armed with 4 nose-mounted 30mm Mk108 cannons, the Me 262 was a bomber killer. A single burst could rip a B-17 to pieces. Some were equipped with racks of R4M unguided rockets designed to scatter entire formations with one pass. But the jet's arrival was plagued by problems. The Yumo engines were revolutionary but unreliable. They often failed after as little as 25 flight hours, and they accelerated so slowly that taking off and landing was dangerous. Allied pilots quickly exploited this, circling German airfields and pouncing as the jets struggled to get airborne. Production was another Achilles heel. By 1944, Germany's industry was collapsing under constant bombing. Materials were scarce, factories were wrecked, and only about 1,000 Me-262s ever reached the front. Even then, Hitler's insistence that the aircraft be used as a fighter bomber rather than purely as an interceptor delayed its deployment in its most effective role. And then there was the pilot problem. The Luftwaffe that had dominated the skies in 1939 and 1940 was gone. Its most experienced flyers had been lost over the years of attrition, leaving many jets in the hands of rookies. The Me-262 was fast, yes, but it was also demanding, and inexperienced pilots often found themselves overwhelmed. Still, in the hands of an ace, it was almost unstoppable. Pilots like Walter Nowotny, one of the Luftwaffe's highest scoring aces, achieved 3 kills in the 262, though even these aces couldn't stem the Allied tide. Despite its flaws, the fear it inspired was real. Allied bomber crews knew that if an Me-262 came into range, their defensive firepower was nearly useless. Escort fighters could do little but wait for the jet to make a mistake, something it rarely did once it was at full speed. Yet, for all its speed and power, the Me-262 couldn't change the outcome. It was a wonder weapon introduced in a war already lost. The Me-262 was feared not for what it achieved, but for what it represented: the dawning of a new era of air combat. To those who saw it streak past in 1944, it was like watching the future break through the clouds. Too late to save Germany, but too early for anyone else to stop it. World War II stands apart in the history of aviation. In just 6 years, the skies went from canvas and metal biplanes to jet fighters, from slow dive bombers to long-range escorts that could cross continents. That's why so many of history's most feared aircraft come from this war. It was the moment when air power truly decided the fate of nation. It was the moment when air power truly decided the fate of nations. But when the war ended in 1945, the story didn't stop. In fact, it accelerated. Within just a few years, the world's next great conflict would erupt, and once again, a new generation of fighters would redefine what it meant to rule the skies. Over the frozen battlefields of Korea, the jet age had arrived. The aircraft that terrified everyone who saw it was the MiG-15. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, the skies were still patrolled by World War II veterans like the Mustangs, the Corsairs, and the B-29 bombers. But by November, a new silhouette appeared above the Yalu River. It had swept wings, a needle nose, and the speed to leave Allied fighters in the dust. Powered by a Soviet-built copy of the Rolls-Royce Nene turbojet, it could climb to nearly 50,000 feet and fly at speeds of over 600 miles per hour. No piston engine aircraft could hope to keep up, and even the first American jets struggled against it. Its firepower was brutal. A 37mm cannon paired with two 23mm cannons made it a natural bomber killer. One hit could rip a B-29 apart. Losses became so severe that the US was forced to pull B-29s from daylight missions entirely, relegating them to night raids where the MiGs were less effective. Allied planes like the F-80 Shooting Star, F-94 Starfire, and even the vaunted P-51 Mustang were simply outclassed. In climb rate, ceiling, and raw acceleration, the MiG-15 held the advantage. The American answer was the F-86 Sabre, rushed into service to counter the threat. In the hands of skilled US pilots, the Sabre fought the MiG on nearly even terms, but even then, it wasn't a guaranteed edge. The Sabre had better handling at low altitudes and a superior gun sight, but the MiG could outclimb, out-accelerate, and reach higher altitudes. Many Sabre veterans admitted privately that the MiG had the better performance. What turned the tide was training, tactics, and experience carried over from World War II. For the men who fought in MiG Alley, the fear was constant. The silver shape could appear out of the sun, unleash a burst of cannon fire, and vanish before you could react. And unlike the Me-262 of World War II, the MiG wasn't a rare curiosity. It was mass-produced with thousands built and deployed. The MiG made every propeller fighter obsolete overnight. It humbled the bomber, once considered untouchable, and it forced the West to admit that the Soviet Union wasn't catching up in aviation technology, they had leapt ahead. By the 1960s, that race had taken the world into the skies over Vietnam. New generations of jets filled the air, faster, heavier, and more advanced than anything seen in Korea. And at the center of it all was one of the most iconic aircraft ever built. It was enormous, loud, and could carry a weapons load that rivaled a bomber. A beast that seemed to be everywhere at once. This was the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II. The Phantom was unlike any fighter before it. Nearly 63 feet long, with twin engines capable of pushing it past Mach 2, it was a giant in the skies. Originally designed for the US Navy, it soon became the backbone of American air power across every branch of the military. Its reputation was built on power and versatility. The F-4 could haul missiles, bombs, rockets, and reconnaissance gear. It could dogfight, strike ground targets, or escort bombers. In Vietnam, it became the workhorse of the US air campaign, flying more combat sorties than any other American aircraft. Early in the war, Phantom crews relied on heavy missiles. Armed with AIM-7E Sparrows and AIM-9B Sidewinders, the F-4 was intended to destroy its enemies at range. But in the chaos of Vietnam's skies, things didn't always go as planned. Missiles often missed or failed to fire, and in close combat, the Phantom's lack of an internal gun was a serious handicap. Despite those challenges, the F-4 quickly earned respect from both sides. Its raw speed allowed it to engage or disengage at will. Its ability to carry heavy bomb loads meant it could strike with devastating effect. The Phantom's combat record tells the story. It scored more than 140 aerial victories in Vietnam, many against the nimble MiG-17s and MiG-21s flown by the North Vietnamese Air Force. And though it suffered losses, it was the Phantom that dominated the air campaign, staying in service long after other designs faded away. By the 1970s, newer fighters like the F-14 Tomcat and F-15 Eagle would surpass it, but the Phantom remained a legend. It was feared for its sheer presence, a machine that combined the firepower of a bomber with the speed of a fighter. The F-4 Phantom II was feared because it was overwhelming. In the skies of Vietnam, it was the brute force of the jet age made real. But technology never stands still. The lessons of Vietnam were clear. Raw power wasn't enough. Pilots needed agility, radar precision weapons, and above all, a fighter designed for air superiority from the start, not adapted to it later. Out of that need came an aircraft that would dominate the skies for decades. The iconic McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle. The Eagle entered service in the mid-1970s, and it was everything the Phantom was not. Sleek, fast, agile, and built around a single mission: air superiority. Where the Phantom was a jack of all trades, the F-15 was a purebred hunter. Its specifications were staggering. Twin Pratt & Whitney F-100 engines gave it a thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1:1, meaning it could accelerate straight up, literally climbing vertically. Its radar, the APG-63, was one of the most advanced in the world, able to detect and track multiple targets beyond visual range. Armed with a 20mm Vulcan cannon and an array of Sidewinders, Sparrows, and later AIM-120 AMR AAMs, it could engage in any scenario and in almost any conditions. From the moment it entered service, the F-15 built a reputation as untouchable. In combat, It's racked up more than 100 aerial victories without a single loss in air-to-air combat. Israeli pilots flying the Eagle in the 1970s and 80s scored dozens of kills against Syrian and Iraqi aircraft. American Eagles in the Gulf War swept the skies clean of MiG-29s, Mirages, and anything else the Iraqi Air Force could throw at them. For opponents, facing an F-15 meant knowing the odds were stacked against you before the fight even began. Its radar saw farther, its missiles reached farther, its engines climbed higher. Once it locked on, survival was a matter of luck, not skill. The Eagle was feared because it embodied the shift in modern air combat, from close-range dogfights to beyond visual range engagements where the enemy could be destroyed before you even saw him. For decades, no rival could claim superiority. The Eagle ruled the skies, earning its place as the most successful modern fighter ever built. However, the US Air Force knew it needed something else alongside it. The Eagle was big, expensive, and designed purely for air superiority. America also wanted a lighter, more affordable fighter, one that could dogfight with precision, strike ground targets, and be exported to allies around the world. The answer was the General Dynamics F-16 fighting Falcon, better known simply as the Viper. The F-16 was born out of the lightweight fighter program of the 1970s, and from the start, it was revolutionary. It was the first production fighter designed to be aerodynamically unstable, something that sounds insane but gave it incredible maneuverability. Its computer-controlled fly-by-wire system constantly corrected its flight path, allowing the pilot to pull off tight turns and aggressive maneuvers no stable aircraft could match. One of its most iconic features was the bubble canopy, giving pilots unmatched visibility in a dogfight. Combined with a side-stick controller, a reclined ejection seat, and its agility, the F-16 gave American pilots a cockpit designed for the fight itself. Unlike the purebred Eagle, it was also an outstanding strike craft. It could carry precision bombs, rockets, and guided munitions, making it a true multi-role fighter decades before the F-35 was even imagined. In combat, the F-16 quickly earned its place. Israel was one of its first operators, using it in 1981 to carry out the famous strike on Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor. In 1982, Israeli F-16 scored dozens of aerial kills against Syrian aircraft over Lebanon. American F-16s later flew thousands of sorties in the Gulf War, striking ground targets and tangling with Iraqi fighters. But beyond its combat record, the F-16 came to symbolize something bigger: American air power itself. Exported to more than 24 nations, the Viper became the face of Western aviation in the late Cold War. Its silhouette was a familiar sight from NATO airfields in Europe to training ranges in the US desert. Over 4,500 F-16s have been built, and it remains in frontline service to this day, more than 40 years after its first flight. It may not have the spotless record of the F-15, but in sheer presence, versatility, and longevity, the Viper became one of the most feared and most recognized fighters of the modern era. But while the Viper was flying in plain sight, the United States was preparing something different altogether, an aircraft that wasn't meant to be seen at all. It didn't need to outturn or outclimb an enemy fighter. Its job was simple: to strike at the very heart of an opponent's defenses, and to do it without ever being detected. This was the Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk. Nicknamed the Stealth Fighter, the F-117 was unlike anything the world had seen before. Angular, faceted, and almost alien in appearance, it was designed to scatter radar waves and slip unnoticed through enemy defenses. In truth, it wasn't a fighter at all. It was a precision strike aircraft. But the name F-117 served its purpose, projecting an image of menace and mystery. Beneath its skin, the Nighthawk carried advanced avionics and laser-guided bombs. It couldn't dogfight, and it wasn't fast. Its top speed was barely above subsonic, but it could do something no other aircraft could: penetrate the most heavily defended airspace in the world and destroy targets with pinpoint accuracy. The F-117 revealed its power in 1989 during Operation Just Cause in Panama, but it was in the Gulf War of 1991 that it became legendary. On the opening night of the conflict, Nighthawks flew into Baghdad, one of the most heavily defended cities on Earth. Soon, radar sites, command bunkers, and communication centers were all destroyed before Iraq's defenses even realized they'd been attacked. For the first time in history, a plane could kill without being seen, and that made it terrifying. In the Gulf War alone, F-117s flew over 1,200 sorties, striking the most critical targets with near-perfect accuracy, and not a single one was lost in combat. The message was clear: stealth had changed the rules. The F-117 represented a new era where you couldn't defend against what you couldn't see. Enemies never saw it coming, only the blast it left behind. It was the future of air warfare made real. The Nighthawk's shape, its aura, and its record made it one of the most feared aircraft of the late 20th century. The F-117 proved that stealth was no longer science fiction, it was the future. But it was a specialized weapon, built only for the shadows. The next step was to take that same invisibility and give it to a true fighter. By the 1990s, the United States was ready to unveil the next leap forward, the first of a new generation. Stealthy, supersonic, and designed to win every fight before it even began. The Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor. The Raptor entered service in 2005, but even before its debut, it had already earned a reputation as the most advanced fighter ever built. Every part of it was engineered for dominance. Its radar-evading shape, special coatings, and internal weapons bays meant it could slip into contested airspace undetected. Its twin Pratt & Whitney F-119 engines gave it supercruise, the ability to fly faster than the speed of sound without using fuel-guzzling afterburners. But stealth and speed were only part of the equation. The Raptor's radar and sensors allowed pilots to track and engage enemies at distances where they couldn't be seen in return. In combat exercises, F-22 pilots routinely reported killing opponents without ever appearing on their radar screens. In a close fight, the Raptor was just as terrifying. With thrust vectoring nozzles, it could perform maneuvers no other operational fighter could match. Sudden vertical climbs, pivots, and near impossible turns that left opponents overshooting helplessly. Pilots who trained against it described the experience as frustrating, even demoralizing. Its weapons matched its agility. The F-22 carried advanced AIM-120 AMR AAMs and AIM-9 sidewinders internally, as well as a 20mm Vulcan cannon. All were hidden inside to preserve its stealth profile, ready to deploy in seconds. The Raptor is feared less for what it has done and more for what it promises. In exercises and simulations, it's proven to be untouchable, an invisible predator that no rival can match. The F-22 Raptor is the embodiment of air superiority in the 21st century. But the United States wasn't done. If the Raptor was the heavyweight champion of the skies, the next fighter would be something different. A global workhorse, built not just for the US, but for her allies across the world. It's the famous Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II. Where the F-22 was designed to dominate the skies, the F-35 was designed to do something else, and to do it stealthily. Introduced in the 2010s, it came in 3 variants. The F-35A for the Air Force, the F-35B with vertical takeoff and landing for the Marines, and the carrier-capable F-35C for the Navy. Together, they formed the backbone of America's next-generation air power. The Lightning II brought advanced stealth technology to a multi-role platform. Its shape, radar-absorbent materials, and internal weapons bays meant it could slip into hostile airspace unseen. Its sensors fused data from multiple sources, giving pilots what's often described as a god's eye view of the battlefield. Unlike the F-22, which was never exported, the F-35 became a shared weapon of the Western world. Allies from Britain to Japan, Israel to Australia began fielding their own squadrons. Critics pointed to its cost, its complexity, and early development problems. But in combat trials and exercises, the F-35 proved deadly. In mock engagements, it routinely destroyed fourth-generation fighters without ever being detected. Its ability to strike ground targets, suppress defenses, and fight in the air meant it blurred the line between fighter and strike aircraft. Thousands are planned for production. That means wherever US or NATO forces deploy, the Lightning II will be there. The F-35 may not have the raw speed of the Raptor, but it represents something even more powerful: the spread of fifth-generation stealth across the Western Alliance. But even as it entered service, US engineers were already looking to the next frontier. The wars of the future would not just be fought with fighters, they would be shaped by aircraft designed to slip undetected into enemy territory, strike at the heart of defenses, and disappear before anyone knew they were even there. That's the promise of the B-21 radar. Still in development, as of the mid-2020s, the radar is the US Air Force's next-generation stealth bomber intended to replace the aging B-1 and B-2 fleets. Its exact capabilities remain classified, but what has been revealed is enough to alarm America's adversaries. Like the B-2 Spirit before it, the B-21 is a flying wing design, smooth, angular, and built for stealth. It will carry both conventional and nuclear weapons, able to penetrate the most advanced air defenses in the world. But unlike previous bombers, it's designed with cutting-edge digital systems, modular upgrades, and the possibility of unmanned operation in the future. The B-21 is feared for the uncertainty it represents. Will it be invisible to radar? Will it carry hypersonic weapons? Can it operate autonomously? No one outside the program knows for sure, and that secrecy is part of its deterrence. Billions are being spent to upgrade radar networks, missile systems, and air defenses, all in anticipation of a bomber that hasn't even entered full service yet. Even before its first mission, the B-21 has already changed the balance of power. It's the shadow on the horizon, the weapon designed for wars that haven't yet been fought. For over a century, warplanes have been symbols of fear and power, technological leaps that forced enemies to adapt or be crushed. From fragile triplanes to radar-evading bombers, each era produced aircraft that shaped entire wars. They all left their marks, proving that whoever controlled the skies often controlled the war. But what do you think? Which warplane do you think deserves the title of most feared? Was the Red Baron's Fokker DR-1 really scarier than the Allied SPADs or Camels? Did the Me-262 arrive too late to matter, or could it have changed the war if introduced earlier? And when the B-21 radar finally enters service, do you think it will live up to the fear it's already creating? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.